Welcome to the Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates interview series on radio and podcast. The show covering all things health, wellness, culture, and more. The show for all of us who aren't old, we're better. Each week, we'll interview superstars, experts, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things, all related to this wonderful experience of getting better, not just older. Now, here's your host, the award-winning Paul Vogelzang.
Thank you. And let me just say, we are coming up on a remarkable moment. In just a short time, the United States will mark 250 years since the signing of the Declaration of Independence, a document filled with bold language about liberty, equality, and human dignity. Welcome to the Not Old Better Show Smithsonian Associates interview series on radio and podcast. You know, for 10 years now, the Not Old Better Show has celebrated health, wellness, culture, history, and the stories that remind us we're not old, we're better now. As America commemorates 250 years of independence in 2026, this special series offers a dynamic explanation of America's past, present, and future. Explore the people, ideas, conflicts, and aspirations that have shaped America and how the past informs the challenges and possibilities ahead. At 250, America is still young enough to dream and seasoned enough to know that freedom asks something of every generation. Through our Smithsonian Associates interview series, we invite you to hear that story and more stories with a fresh perspective, honest reflection, and renewed purpose. In this series, we're stepping back, not to settle history, but to explore it, to look at the places, the people, and the moments that have shaped who we are and who we're still becoming. Looking back at those people 250 years ago, I'm just struck by this small group of revolutionaries who signed a document that changed the course of history, the Declaration of Independence. It was bold, imperfect, aspirational, and at its heart was an extraordinary idea that power belongs to the people. Now, as America approaches its 250th birthday, the celebration itself has become something larger than fireworks and ceremonies. It's become a national conversation about history, democracy, citizenship, truth, and who gets to tell the American story. My guest today is one of the nation's leading historians, Dr. Julian Zelizer. He's a professor of history and public affairs at Princeton University, a CNN political analyst, host of the Politics and Polls podcast, and author or editor of more than 25 books on American political life, presidential history, civil rights, Congress, and democracy itself. Dr. Zelizer has written that America's 250th anniversary may serve as a test of the nation, of our institutions, our freedoms, and our willingness to protect democratic norms in an era of political division and misinformation. Today, we'll talk with Dr. Zelizer about the founders, polarization, patriotism, democratic resilience, and why this anniversary may say as much about America's future as its past. And for many of us who have lived through decades of political and cultural change, this conversation asks a deeply personal question. What kind of country are we leaving behind? My conversation with historian Dr. Julian Zelizer begins now. Dr. Julian Zelizer, welcome to the program.
Great to be with you.
So nice to talk to you. We're talking a little bit about America's 250th anniversary coming up here very soon. We are talking in April. July 4th is just right around the corner. And in my research of you, I've read that you look at this date, particularly even over 250 years, as an important one, that kind of a test for our country, almost a milestone in terms of the amount of freedom that Americans really retain. And I wonder if you'd tell us what you mean by that.
Well, when I write and teach about the United States, I just see it as a country full of contradictions and tensions, and both great accomplishments and great failures. And those tensions are present in any moment in American history. They are often what makes up the stories of different periods as people wrestle with those. So I think when you have a commemoration like this, it's natural and it's in fact healthy for the country to think about where we are with some of these ongoing questions that have been there from the revolution through today, such as the strength of our democratic institutions, the freedom to debate, racial relations and equality, all of that. These are the moments we have to almost take step back and say, where are we? And how do we fit at this moment in the long history of the country?
Let's talk for a second about the founders because they certainly set up a government that was based on rules, based on institutions, based on a number of things that the Constitution really spells out very well. What do you think at this point they would be most proud of?
Well, they would certainly be proud that it endured. I mean, when
Yeah.
the country was founded, that was not inevitable. And there were certainly big questions of would this all work? Would this idea of representative democracy actually function and survive? So many republics had failed, and they themselves were part of a rebellion against another government, which they believed to be broken. So I think certainly the endurance of the institutions and the structure that they created would be their achievement. They were very limited in terms of their conception of democracy, as we know. It just didn't include broad swaths of the population, but the very notion of having a government that ultimately, in their times, part of the country was voting for, over time, a much bigger part of the country was voting for, that it survived as a system with all its failures, with all its vulnerabilities, I think would be seen as an accomplishment.
Yeah, it's interesting because on the flip side, you would think that some of this related issue regarding elections and certainly who votes and the transition of power. Talk about that for a second because that I think would genuinely just be concerning.
I mean, one thing which I certainly have become more cognizant of in the last 10 years than I was when I've been writing about these issues for so long is how important norms and informal rules have been to government. Meaning, it's not simply about institutions, it's not simply about a written constitution, it's about what leaders will or won't do. And so the transfer of power is a very powerful and disturbing example. We saw in 2020 when that was challenged how easy it is in some ways to challenge that if someone is willing to go there. And we've seen this in other areas. And certainly, if the transfer of power is not stable, that contradicts the basic argument that the founders were trying to make about how government would work. There has to be an acceptance that the loser turns over, the keys to the White House, so to speak, in Capitol Hill peacefully. So that has certainly been something that grows out of a willingness to abandon old norms that I think we need to pay closer attention to in politics.
You've really spent a good portion of your career helping us see how the political tensions, the previous political tensions, really serve to almost give us an illustration of where we are today. And if you look at that, if you look at where we are right now, which historical moment gives you a sense that this has all been very instructive, that in fact we can look back and say, yeah, we've learned, but what have we learned?
I mean, I never have one period, and I often kind of back away because I don't want to make the comparison. This is that. Every period is different, but two periods that certainly are important to study now. One would be the pre-Civil War era. Not that we are heading into a civil war, but that there are moments when the institutions of government are just not functioning to solve the problems that we face as a society. That was the most dramatic and leads to a total collapse of the republic. But I think understanding how that can happen and ultimately how vulnerable our government can be if we're not careful, if we kind of are not attuned to it, for me is interesting to look back on as not a guide for where we are, but certainly lessons about some of the risks we face if we take this for granted. And second, I spent a lot of my time studying the 1960s, and I do still think that many of the tensions there over issues ranging from race relations to culture and cultural norms, to ideas of the family and much more, and war, are all still very much with us. We're still living with many of those debates, even if the politics of the country has shifted. I find that period very instructive, and you can see how deeply rooted these divisions are that we often think are a product of the last 2 years of social media. They're in fact major questions of post World War II America.
You also talk about who tells the story going forward. Certainly, it's a good time to reflect back on 250 years, but it's almost more important to look at where we're headed and this story of our future. Are we telling it the right way? Is there the right group telling it? What do we need to know about that in order to be careful and give us a little pause for caution?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, I would say, A, there is no story. There are stories of America. And then the more you study it, the more that becomes clear. People go through the classic moments of our times. Where were you when President Kennedy was assassinated? You have an answer, I was here, there. But if you actually ask kind of what people were living through, a sharecropper in Mississippi would have a very different memory and take on that moment than, as a wealthy white American living in one of the big cities of the country. And so I think we have to push ourselves, not just historians, but all of us, to think of the different stories that make up America. That's what's most interesting. And second, I think the point you're making is we can't just tell it from the perspective of a handful of people. That's what history since the 60s has really emphasized. You can't just focus on the presidents and a few, elites in the media to know what this country was about. You have to get down to communities and to different parts of the country and really unpack what this story and these stories looked like, from all sorts of perspectives, including people who were on the losing end of a given moment. And so that's the challenge of good history.
If you're just joining us, my guest today is Princeton historian Dr. Julian Zelizer, and we're talking about America at 250 years. Coming up next, we move beyond the history books and into one of the biggest questions facing the country right now. Who controls the American story? Dr. Zelizer explains why battles over monuments, misinformation, patriotism, and even the meaning of democracy itself have become central to this 250th anniversary moment. And later, Dr. Zelizer will share his thoughts on what the founders might recognize and what would leave them deeply unsettled about modern America. Don't go anywhere. We will be right back with Dr. Julian Zelizer. Our guest today is Dr. Julian Zelizer. Dr. Zelizer is here with us celebrating America 250 and our series. Dr. Zelizer is a Princeton professor of history and public affairs, a CNN political analyst, and one of our country's leading voices on American political history. Dr. Zelizer, we very much appreciate your time. In my research and in preparation today, I listened to an interview recently where you talked about America's kind of virtuous period and aspects of our country that perhaps even were more virtuous in times past. What do you mean by that, our virtuous history?
Well, I think there are moments when significant parts of the country were trying not just to protect the democracy or to continue the democracy, to make it better. So I think of Reconstruction, for example, as a moment in many ways of virtue, where the country actually wrestled with the history of slavery and racial inequality and tried to do something about it. It wasn't just thoughts and prayers. It was a bold government agenda. to try to really remake certainly what Southern society could and would look like. In the end, it failed, and we move in the wrong direction. But that period, I think, is quite remarkable. I still think of World War II for all its flaws and limitations, and there are many. But the way in which the country, not simply President Roosevelt, mobilized and was pivotal in a war against global fascism, which posed a very serious and devastating threat, not just to the United States, but to the world, is there's a lot of virtue in what the U.S. accomplished. So that is not to say the country is always great or even these periods are not complicated, but those are two moments that I think are quite impressive. One last one that I've written about back to where we were is the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 65, which is obviously connected to Reconstruction, where in the wake of civil rights protests, in the wake of the Selma March, Congress and President Lyndon Johnson did something about the problem. They put laws on the books that would protect that basic right.
We'll have links so that our audience can find out more about Dr. Zelizer's work, in particular his books. And I want to ask you, Dr. Zelizer, about your Myth America book, because in it you talk about several long-held beliefs. And I think as we celebrate America's 250th anniversary, I want to ask you if you'd maybe cite two myths that you think in particular, some in our older generation of audience, what we might have missed there with those myths, and what we can look at in terms of reevaluating them.
Well, one in that book in particular that I always find interesting was by Michael Kazin, a very wonderful historian at Georgetown, who wrote, and this is a myth that has broad implications about what is the role of socialism in American politics. And traditionally, the argument is there's no socialism in the US, it's simply a fringe and movement. And he basically put together an essay showing that while we don't have a socialist government, a socialist party at a mass level, it's had a huge impact, the left, on mainstream political debates. That basically some of the ideas pushed from kind of socialist and socialist allied groups have made it into what we consider, mainstream public policy, such as the Social Security program. And I think that's as true for the frankly right as left, but that the country is not simply a country of the center. And so that's a myth that I really find interesting. There's an essay in there that kind of takes on the idea that the opponents of feminism were pro-family after the 1960s, and feminists were not. And the author essentially looks at how invested feminism has been since the 70s in policies and ideas that would actually strengthen and expand the family rather than erode it. And I don't know. I read that essay and I think it has a lot of lessons for today. Those are two. I mean, all the authors really have terrific points. Glenda Gilmore has a wonderful essay about civil rights that just explodes the idea there's a period of peaceful civil rights versus more turbulent civil rights, or radical versus mainstream. These are all kind of mixed up through a long period of civil rights politics. So those are three.
Thank you for that. You mentioned social media a few minutes ago, and I want to talk about that. Certainly, it's had a huge impact. And we live in this age where news, everything just travels so quickly, but it doesn't always travel accurately. And so I wonder
Yep.
if you talk a little bit about today's media environment and how it really impacts our capacity to share some of this common understanding, and really how it even changes some of the events and the way they're interpreted and how we live.
It's one of the biggest realities we have, and I think for historians and people who write about history, it's important. The good news is, I do think it's broadened the platforms and it's allowed much more access to different voices. As we were talking about within the history telling project, to have their ideas heard and to get information out there. That's a good thing. There's not as much of a lock on information as there was when I started my career in the 1990s, frankly, where there was a few institutions you can get out there, but other than that, there was no way to reach a broad public. That's just not true anymore, and that's a good thing. The bad thing is, yes, there's just so much bad information out there that isn't simply bad, it's packaged as legitimate. And it just puts a lot more, I think, burden on the reader, on the listener, on the viewer to really filter through what's good, accurate, and what's not. And I do fear, though, in terms of kind of teaching history and talking about history, it's getting a lot harder. There's just many more voices you're competing with, not who with disagreement's great. It's essential to history. That is literally what we do. We debate how do you interpret what happened. But we are at a point now where what happened is totally up for grabs. And it's not even a debate about who has the best material, it's making up material. And so I think it's a very hard world to navigate. But for me, it's more important to be out there and to try to use the platforms well so people can get good information and think for themselves about where they want to take that history.
The idea of the platforms and the people is a big one to you, and you talk about it. You actually make it very clear that protecting the democracy isn't so much about our systems or the platform. It's really very much about the people. And so for those in our audience who have witnessed 60s, 70s, 80s, all of these moments of change during their lifetimes, what does meaningful civic engagement really look like today? Instruct us. Tell us a little bit about how we can do this better.
I mean, I do watch. I've watched over the past year these No Kings protests, and I,
Yes.
I think that's
Yes.
very meaningful engagement.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And I don't look. It doesn't have to be only for those groups. I mean, we've seen in, conservative groups in the 70s were doing forms of it, but I watched the No Kings, and I see this kind of moment in American history where for a while there was the conventional wisdom that there was no way to really oppose the direction of politics. So there's no way to depose what the president was doing and the kinds of policies he was putting into place. And then people just said, well, we don't agree with that. And it was a simple act of going to a rally. It was a simple act of connecting different parts of the community through information so they knew where events were taking place. And we've been through several rounds of these. And I watched this and I find it a remarkable example of civic engagement where people were willing to do what law firms were not willing to do, what some university presidents simply say no and simply say, we want a different America. And that's a great act of citizen engagement. I'm a believer in the world of ideas. And I do think when people try to write or, communicate in however you communicate today, sometimes it might be TikTok. If you do it well and you're trying to reach people about the political questions that we face, that's also a form of civic engagement. And finally, obviously, if you get involved at a bigger level organizationally in civic community organizations involved with politics, nonprofit groups, or even go into politics. I now know people, who are in office. Those are forms. Those are virtuous acts to give of yourself to the nation. So I think those are just three ways in which civic participation can be very, very real. And I'd add, it doesn't just have to be politics. I mean, I think people who are involved in building the kind of civic ties that are essential to our country, whether through religious institutions or maybe even sporting organizations in a community, those are really important at pushing against the fragmentation and individualization of our culture.
I appreciate that. I have to tell you, I love driving under the overpasses and see just a small group stringing whatever it is, tape or a message through the chain link, and
Yes.
just using that venue as their means to kind of share in a very, very tiny micro-sized group, 2 or 3 people. But it's very impressive.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm finishing a book about a civil rights story in 1964. It involves Mississippi, and when we think of the civil rights here, I think of a lot of us think of the charismatic leaders, the Martin Luther Kings, and Ella Bakers, and others. But often it was just kind of regular people in a community in much more terrifying situations, frankly. But just regular people going out and saying, I'm going to go near the courthouse and walk around the courthouse to protest, that made the civil rights movement that we know today. And I think that is a constant. We saw it with the anti-war movement. It was often not simply the prominent leaders that you see on YouTube clips, but college students or the, community members in middle class communities who went out to a protest. And those acts are very, very powerful. And I think they have been essential to a good democracy.
Dr. Zelizer, just a couple more questions. I promise that I'm
Yeah,
out of your hair for
yeah,
good
yeah.
today. Well, here we are. We're on the threshold. July 4th is coming at us like a steam train, and I wonder what you think, both as a historian, but also as an American reflecting on our future America. What's a successful anniversary look like?
That's a great question. I think it's one where we are honest in our commemorations. So I'm very disturbed by efforts to whitewash, so to speak, the history. So look, some celebrations could just be barbecues and wearing, red, white, and blue clothes, and that's fine and that's good and that's healthy. I think there's a great place for that and fun parades down Main Street. But I think we also need moments over the summer to have either shows on media or in museums, which really look at some of the struggles we have gone through, like a commemoration that doesn't examine race and race relations in this country at all. Is not actually a commemoration of the country. That's just public relations. So I hope there's ways in schools, in camps, in summer camps, and communities where we can have that kind of robust discussion and not be scared of it. That's a successful commemoration to me. Right through today, not just celebrating the vote in America, but celebrating the struggle to expand that vote because it was so hard to get for so many people. That's an actual commemoration for me.
Dr. Zelizer, it's just been a pleasure talking with you. Congratulations on all of your work. I'll just say selfishly, I'd love to have you back talking about your book on civil rights. Please consider that. Please consider as a friendly spot for you on your tours. And have a great rest of your day. Congratulations on all this stuff. We'll have links on all of your work, but we sure appreciate your generous time today.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
My thanks to Dr. Julian Zelizer for joining us today and bringing such thoughtful perspective to this remarkable moment in American history. As we approach America's 250th anniversary, today's conversation reminds us that democracy has never been automatic. Every generation has faced moments of tension, uncertainty, and reinvention. The story of this country is still being written, not only by elected leaders and historians, but by citizens willing to stay informed, engaged, and involved. And perhaps that's one of the enduring lessons of the Declaration of Independence itself, that freedom asks something of all of us. You can learn more about Dr. Zelizer's work, including his books, Myth in America and In Defense of Partisanship, by visiting us online at notold-better.com, where you'll also find this episode and our extensive library of previous shows, including our Smithsonian Associates series on America at 250 and all the interviews that we've done. Follow us on social media, Twitter at Not Old Better and Instagram at Not Old Better for updates, upcoming guests, behind-the-scenes moments, and all kinds of additional conversations. The Not Old Better Show is a production of NOBS Studios. I'm Paul Vogelzang. Thanks for listening. Be well, be safe, and please join me again next time on the Not Old Better Show on radio and podcast. Thanks, everybody. We will see you next time.